Welcome to Photography with Imre, and that would be me. And on today's episode, the battle of the file formats, RAW versus JPEG. Boom! Come on, I tried this in rehearsal and it worked fine. See, how do I work like this? I just roll the clip. I need a break. Now, before we whoa, excuse me. Hey, my voice cleared up. Okay. Now, before we get into the battle of file formats, let's take a quick overview of what happens when you take a photo with your digital SLR. Let's start at the point where the sensor is being exposed to light. Before light actually hits the electronics that convert it into electrical charges, the light must first pass through a color filter array that sits on the sensor. There are several varieties of color filter arrays, but one of the more common types is a Bayer filter, and here's what its pattern looks like. Each of those red, green, and blue squares correspond with a single pixel on the sensor. So as light passes through those red, green, and blue filters, the intensity of the light is recorded as an electrical charge, then converted into a voltage, and finally transformed into data via the circuitry of the camera. At this point, we reach a fork in the road, so to speak, and the path taken depends on whether you've opted to save your photos as RAW or JPEG. Let's continue by taking the road that leads us to the camera saving the photo in JPEG format. So at the moment, we have some raw pixel data from the camera sensor, but on its own it doesn't really constitute an image. As you can see, each pixel only represents a red, green, or blue value. In other words, a single pixel does not have color information like the images we're generally used to seeing. Thus, the brain of the camera runs the data through a fairly complex routine called a demosaicing algorithm, which in very simple terms compares a grouping of those red, green, and blue pixels to form a single full-color pixel. By the way, white balance is also applied during this stage. Once this is done, we finally have something that more closely resembles an image, but there are still a few steps to go before a JPEG file is saved. Digital sensors respond in a linear fashion to light, so for example, twice the amount of light hitting a sensor will make it respond twice as much, 3 times the amount of light will make the sensor respond 3 times as much, and so on. But our eyes respond logarithmically to light, so twice the amount of light to our eyes is not twice as bright, roughly closer to half that. Human eyes are also much more adaptive to scenes with strong contrast. For example, we can see good detail in shadows even on a bright sunny day. So in order to make the photo brighter and more aesthetically pleasing to us, a tone curve is applied to the image. But wait, there's more. Contrast, saturation, and sharpening is also applied to the image, generally based on the user-adjustable settings provided by most digital SLRs. And raw image data generally has a greater bit depth than JPEG files, usually 12 or 14 bits depending on the sensor. So before saving, the image needs to be converted into 8-bit mode. Finally, we can save the image. Now keep in mind that what I've presented is a simplified overview and some details were omitted. For example, I didn't even mention the conversion of the data into a particular color space. In addition, the order of operations may differ from manufacturer to manufacturer, and certain camera models may perform additional processing. But nonetheless, this hopefully gives you some idea of what goes on behind the scenes. And for those of you who are really curious about the technicalities, you guessed it, I have some great website links on my supplemental blog post for this video. Actually, a lot for this one. We're now going to travel back in time to that fork in the road to see what the camera does when we want our photos to be saved in RAW format. Remember, at this point, all we have is the raw pixel data directly from the camera sensor. So what does the camera do with it? Well, compared to the previous section, not a lot. The camera just saves the raw pixel data more or less as is, along with something called metadata. The metadata contains details such as the model of your camera and boatloads of settings such as the focal length the image was shot at, sensitivity setting, what the white balance was, and what the sharpness, contrast, saturation settings are set to. But to be clear, the raw pixel data is more or less left alone. This is why you need some sort of image editing software to open and process RAW files, because instead of the camera doing all the work, the software and your computer perform all those image processing steps. And this brings us to some of the pros and cons of RAW and JPEG files. Alright, and that concludes part 1, but stay tuned for part 2, because at the end you find out who wins the battle of the file formats, RAW or JPEG. To be continued.